A millionaire sees his childhood love begging with 2 3-year-old twin children and recognizes her, but what he does next is unbelievable. Before we start the story, comment below which city you're watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone. Joe Blackwood, a ruthless millionaire of 35, was crossing a busy street corner when something caught his attention. A woman dressed in dirty, worn clothes with disheveled hair was sitting on the sidewalk. Her face was tired and marked by suffering. Beside her were 2 little girls, twins, about 3 years old, wearing tattered clothes. One of them was quietly crying, rubbing her eyes with small, dirty hands. "Sweetheart, it's okay. Someone will help us soon," the woman murmured, stroking the child's hair with a trembling voice full of desperate love. Joe felt a pang in his chest. He knew that face. Even through the dirt and pain, it couldn't be, but it was Amelia Bradstone, the love of his youth, the girl he used to admire from afar. She had never noticed him in school except to mock his awkward attempts to get her attention. Now she was here, vulnerable and helpless. Joe approached slowly, his heart racing. "Amelia," he called hesitantly. The woman slowly lifted her head, her eyes widening as she recognized his voice. "Joe?" For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy with painful memories. Then Amelia lowered her gaze, as if wishing to disappear. "What happened to you?" he asked, unable to hide his concern. Amelia looked away, clutching the girls even tighter. "It doesn't matter. We're fine. Go away, Joe." But Joe couldn't ignore what he saw. One of the girls was sobbing from hunger while the other clung to her mother's arm, staring at him with wide, frightened eyes. The pain and despair of the scene hit him like a blow. "You're not fine. Come with me. I'll help you." "No, I can't," Amelia began to protest. "I'm not leaving you and your daughters out here in the cold. You're coming with me and I won't take no for an answer." The girls looked at him, curious yet cautious. The one who had been crying pressed her lips together, holding back her tears. Amelia hesitated, but Joe's determined gaze made her relent. She knew she had no other choice. Joe pulled out his phone and called his driver. "Be here in 5 minutes," he said before putting the phone away. "Let's go. There's no reason for you to stay here." He extended his hand to Amelia, who reluctantly took it. When the car arrived, Joe helped Amelia get in, carrying one of the girls while she held the other. The children were exhausted, their faces resting on their mother's shoulders. During the ride to Joe's mansion, the silence was oppressive. Amelia stared out the window, lost in thought, while Joe glanced at her occasionally, trying to understand how her life had fallen apart. When they arrived, Amelia looked visibly uncomfortable. The grand mansion, with its warm lights and immaculate garden, seemed like another world. "You don't have to do this, Joe. We can do. No more arguing, Amelia. You'll come inside, eat something, and rest." The housekeeper, Mrs. Cooper, opened the door with a surprised expression but said nothing. Joe instructed her to prepare a room for Amelia and the girls. While Mrs. Cooper took care of that, Joe brought Amelia and the children to the living room. He lit the fireplace, creating a cozy warmth, and asked for food to be prepared for them. "Thank you, Joe." "Really, thank you," Amelia said, her eyes brimming with tears as the girls curled up on the sofa beside her. Joe nodded, his mind racing. He knew this night was just the beginning. Tomorrow, he needed to understand what had truly happened to Amelia and how she had ended up here. The sun was just beginning to peek through the windows of Joe's mansion, but Amelia, now 29, was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed. She watched her twins, Clara and Gracie, who were still sleeping soundly. For the first time in a long time, her daughters were warm and comfortable. That should have eased her heart, but instead, she felt a growing knot in her throat. Across the mansion, Joe Blackwood was also awake, sitting in his private study, thinking about everything he had seen the night before. The image of Amelia on the sidewalk, holding her children, wouldn't leave his mind. He needed to understand how this had happened. After all, the Amelia he had known in school had been confident, full of life, someone who seemed destined for great things. Shortly after, Mrs. Cooper knocked gently on Amelia's door. "Miss Bradstone, breakfast is ready. Mr. Blackwood would like you and the girls to come down." Amelia thanked her and woke the twins. A few minutes later, they went downstairs together to the dining room where a generous breakfast spread awaited them. The girls ran excitedly to the chairs, delighted by the variety of fruits, pastries, and juices. Amelia, however, hesitated. "Please have a seat," Joe said, appearing in the doorway. He was wearing a crisp white dress shirt and looked relaxed, though his eyes revealed a serious undertone. "Thank you," Amelia replied, pulling out a chair while watching Clara and Gracie eat enthusiastically. During the meal, an awkward silence lingered between Joe and Amelia. He knew he needed to tread carefully, but he was determined to understand the truth. When the girls finished eating, Mrs. Cooper took them to play in an adjacent room. Amelia remained seated, now alone with Joe. He rested his elbows on the table and looked her straight in the eye. "Amelia, we need to talk. I want to understand what happened to you," he said. She averted her gaze, clasping her hands in her lap. "It's not a story I like to tell. I'm not here to judge. I just want to help." Joe paused, choosing his words carefully. "When I saw you yesterday, you and your daughters were in a situation that, well, it doesn't happen overnight. What happened, Amelia?" She took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment before beginning to speak. "After we graduated high school, I started dating Ryan Mercer. You remember him, don't you?" Joe nodded, his jaw tightening at the mention of the name. He remembered Ryan all too well, someone everyone admired, yet who wouldn't hesitate to hurt others to get what he wanted. "Ryan and I started dating right after graduation. I was deeply in love and thought he felt the same. A few months later, I found out I was pregnant. When I told him, I thought we'd face it together, but he abandoned me. He said he wasn't ready to be a father and didn't want the responsibility. That was the last time I saw him." Joe clenched his fists on the table, struggling to contain the anger welling up inside him. "He just left you?" Amelia nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "Yes. I was alone with no support. My parents couldn't help much, and I did what I could to provide for the girls. But it wasn't enough. Eventually, I lost my job, and over time the bills piled up. When Clara and Gracie were 2, we were evicted from our apartment. Since then, we've been living on the streets, relying on the kindness of strangers." Joe sat in silence, processing everything he had just heard. The Amelia he had once known was strong, but life had broken her in ways he never imagined. "Why didn't you ever ask for help?" he finally asked, his voice softer now. "I was ashamed," Amelia admitted. "Ashamed of how my life had fallen apart. I didn't want anyone to see me like this, especially someone like you." Joe took a deep breath, feeling a mix of compassion and sadness. "Amelia, no one deserves to go through this. You're not alone anymore. I'll help you and your daughters get back on your feet." "Why, Joe? Why are you doing all this?" she asked. He hesitated but knew he had to be honest. "Because, despite everything, I care about you. I've always cared." Amelia sat in silence, unable to respond. Joe's words echoed in her mind as she tried to process everything that was happening. That night, as Amelia tucked the girls into bed, she reflected on what Joe had said. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of hope, but she also knew that accepting help meant facing her deepest fears and rebuilding her life from scratch. The next morning, as sunlight poured through the mansion's large windows, Amelia woke to the soft laughter of Clara and Gracie playing on the carpet beside the bed. For a moment, she felt like she was dreaming. It was hard to believe that just 24 hours earlier, she'd been sitting on a sidewalk, unsure where their next meal would come from. She stretched and called the girls to get ready. Fresh clothes had been set out in the room, thoughtfully chosen by Mrs. Cooper. Amelia was touched by this kindness, though she still felt out of place in such a luxurious setting. When they went downstairs for breakfast, Joe was already in the living room, reviewing some documents. He looked up when he heard the twins' footsteps and gave a faint smile. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. Clara nodded eagerly while Gracie shyly held her mother's hand. "Yes, it was the best night we've had in a long time," Amelia replied, a touch of gratitude in her voice. "I'm glad to hear that," Joe said, gesturing for them to sit. "You don't have to worry about anything today. I want you to rest. The girls can play in the garden or wherever they like." Amelia hesitated. "Joe, I don't know how to thank you for all of this, but I don't want to take advantage of your kindness. As soon as I can, I'll find a job," and Joe raised a hand, stopping her. "There's no rush, Amelia. Before anything else, you need to recover. Don't worry about timelines. We'll figure this out together." Despite his reassuring words, Amelia still felt a weight on her chest. Accepting help didn't come naturally to her. However, her daughter's well-being came first, and for their sake, she swallowed her pride. After breakfast, Clara and Gracie went to play in the garden under Mrs. Cooper's supervision. Amelia, meanwhile, helped clear the dishes, feeling uneasy about not contributing more. Joe found her in the kitchen and shook his head as he saw her washing the dishes. "Amelia, you don't have to do that." "I need to do something, Joe," she replied. "I don't feel right just taking everything without giving back." Joe sighed. "If that's how you feel, fine, but for now I want to talk about the girls. Do they have everything they need?" Amelia paused, thinking. They need a few things like clothes and shoes. What they have is old and worn. Great. Let's go out and get what they need, Joe said. Amelia's eyes widened. That's not necessary, Joe. I can manage later. No discussion, he replied with a gentle smile. I'll get the car. Half an hour later, Amelia, Clara, and Gracie were at Little Wonders, a popular children's boutique in downtown Boston Hills, with Joe watching closely. The girls were delighted, running between the racks and trying on new clothes. Can I really get this, Mommy? Clara asked, holding a sparkling blue dress. Amelia's heart ached at the sight of her daughter's bright, hopeful eyes. Yes, sweetheart, you can. Gracie, the more reserved twin, held up a pair of new sneakers. Me too, Mommy? Amelia nodded with an emotional smile. You too, my love. Joe watched silently, pleased to see the girls so happy. After picking out clothes, shoes, and a few toys, he took them to Sunny Days Cafe for lunch. During the meal, the twins chattered excitedly, sharing stories and playing with each other. Amelia watched them, feeling a sense of relief as she saw them smiling at last. You've done so much for us today, Joe. Thank you, she said sincerely. I've only done what anyone should do, he replied casually. You deserve this, Amelia, he added. She lowered her eyes, the shame creeping back. She knew Joe was being kind, but she couldn't help remembering how she had treated him in the past. You're a much better person than I was to you, Joe, she murmured, almost inaudibly. He frowned. Amelia, the past is behind us. What matters now is what we do moving forward. She nodded, though the guilt still lingered. When they returned to the mansion, the twins ran straight to the garden, showing off their new clothes. Amelia watched them from the living room window, a smile on her face. For the first time in years, she felt safe. Joe, standing beside her, broke the silence. They're incredible little girls. They're my strength, Amelia replied. Even in the worst moments, they gave me a reason to keep going. Joe looked at her with admiration. You're stronger than you realize, Amelia. To go through everything you have and still stand tall. That's something few people can do. She sighed. I don't know if it's strength or just stubbornness. But either way, thank you. Joe smiled. If you ever need anything, you know you can count on me. Amelia nodded, finally feeling that she could trust someone besides herself. The next morning, Amelia woke to the soft sunlight streaming through the curtains. Clara and Gracie were still fast asleep, their faces relaxed, free from the worries they had carried on the streets. Amelia watched her daughters for a moment, feeling a mixture of relief and hope. Maybe starting over was possible after all. After getting dressed, she went downstairs and found Joe in the kitchen, sipping coffee and reading the newspaper. He looked up when he heard her footsteps and smiled. Good morning. Did you sleep well? Yes, thank you. And you? Like a rock, he replied, folding the newspaper and standing up. I made coffee for you too. Have a seat. Amelia thanked him, feeling strangely at ease with the routine that was starting to form. As she sipped her coffee, Joe sat across from her and said, I was thinking now that the girls are more comfortable, we can start focusing on you. On me, she asked, surprised. Yes. You mentioned wanting to work again. What kind of job are you looking for? Amelia stayed quiet for a moment, weighing her options. I don't have an academic background, so my options are limited, but I'm willing to do anything that allows me to support my daughters. Joe nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense, but what if you could study? Finish your education and get a job that truly brings you fulfillment. Her eyes widened. Study? That's out of the question, Joe. I don't have the time or resources for that. You'd have both here. I can help with the expenses and make sure the girls are well cared for while you study. Amelia shook her head, incredulous. You've already done so much for us. I can't accept anything more. Joe leaned forward, his expression serious. Amelia, this isn't just about you. It's about Clara and Gracie. If you have the chance to grow stronger, it'll benefit your daughters in the long run. Please, think about it. His words struck her deeply. She knew he was right, but she still struggled with her pride and shame. That evening, after putting the twins to bed, Joe asked Amelia to meet him in his office. I have a proposal for you, he began, handing her a small envelope. She opened it to find information about business and entrepreneurship courses at Boston Hills Community College. I want you to consider taking these courses. You're smart and determined, and I believe you have the potential to achieve great things. This will give you the tools to support yourself and create a better future for your daughters. Amelia looked at the papers, her mind racing to process the offer. "Joe, this is too much. I'm not sure I can do it." "You're more capable than you think," he replied. "You don't have to decide right now. Just consider it." Amelia held the papers tightly, feeling torn between fear and hope. In the days that followed, she began to reflect on Joe's proposal. Gradually, she realized this could be her chance to change her life, and, most importantly, give her daughters the future they deserved. Finally, after much thought, she agreed. She enrolled in the courses, and with Joe's support, began studying during the day while the twins were cared for by Mrs. Cooper. Although the beginning was challenging, Amelia felt reinvigorated as she learned new skills and rediscovered a side of herself she thought she'd lost. Each day was a small victory, and she clung to the idea that she was building something lasting. Joe closely followed her progress, offering encouragement and support whenever she needed it. He knew Amelia needed to believe in herself as much as he believed in her. Amelia, in turn, started to realize how important Joe had become in her life. His constant presence and unwavering support were slowly breaking down the barriers she had built over the years. Her routine was changing quickly. In the mornings, while Clara and Gracie played in the garden, she spent hours studying in the home office Joe had arranged for her. At first, every page she read felt like climbing a mountain, but over time she found her rhythm. Joe's steady encouragement motivated her even more. One afternoon, as Amelia reviewed her notes, Joe walked into the room with a serious expression. She immediately sensed something was wrong. "We need to talk," he said, closing the door behind him. Amelia felt her stomach tighten. "What is it?" "I found someone from your past," Joe replied, sitting across from her. "Ryan Mercer." The name thundered in Amelia's mind. Ryan, the man who had abandoned her when she needed him most, the father of her daughters who had never acknowledged them. She took a deep breath, trying to control the wave of emotions. "What does he have to do with this?" she asked, her voice steadier than she expected. "I've been looking into some things," Joe explained. "I wanted to understand better what happened to you after school. I found Ryan and decided to confront him." "You did what?" Amelia stood startled. "I needed to know the truth about what he did to you and why he abandoned you and the girls." "Joe, you had no right to do that." "Maybe not, but I did it for you." Amelia stayed silent, her chest tight. She knew Joe meant well, but bringing Ryan back into her life felt like reopening a wound that hadn't fully healed. "What did he say?" she finally asked, her voice hesitant. Joe rested his elbows on the table and sighed. "He admitted everything. He said he knew you were pregnant but didn't want to take responsibility. He claimed it was easier to disappear." Amelia felt her anger rise like a tide. She hadn't expected anything different from Ryan, but hearing those words out loud still stung. "Did he mention the girls?" she asked, her eyes brimming with tears. "No," Joe replied. "He didn't even ask about them." Amelia clenched her fists, trying to hold back her tears. As much as she despised Ryan, a part of her had always hoped that one day he would show remorse or at least some curiosity about the daughters he had abandoned. Joe stood and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Amelia, you don't have to face this alone. I'm here." She looked at him, struggling to resist the urge to break down. "Thank you, Joe, but there are things I have to handle on my own." That night, after putting the girls to bed, Amelia sat at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of tea that had gone cold. Joe's words echoed in her mind, and the thought of Ryan lingered like a shadow. She knew that to move forward, she had to confront the past once and for all. In the days that followed, Amelia tried to resume her routine, but she couldn't focus. Memories of Ryan and the confrontation Joe had mentioned weighed on her like an anchor. Joe, noticing the change in her demeanor, decided to give her space but watched her with concern. One morning, Amelia made a decision. She picked up the phone and called Ryan. He answered after a few rings, his voice indifferent on the other end of the line. "Ryan, it's Amelia. We need to talk." There was silence for a few seconds before Ryan replied. "About what?" "It's been years." "It's about the girls," Amelia said. "You've never wanted to know anything about them, but that needs to change, not for me, but for them." Ryan sighed. "Amelia, I've already made it clear I don't want to be part of this." "What do you want me to say? That I'm sorry?" "Because I'm not." Amelia's heart tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "So you'll never meet them, never take any responsibility?" "I've moved on, Amelia." "I think you should too." Before she could respond, the line went dead. She stood there, holding the phone, trying to process the emptiness left by that conversation. It was the closure she needed, but also a harsh confirmation that Ryan would never be part of her daughters' lives. When Joe arrived home that evening, he found Amelia sitting on the couch with the twins asleep beside her. He sat down next to her, waiting silently for her to speak first. "I talked to Ryan," she finally said, breaking the silence. Joe frowned. "And how did it go?" "As I expected," she replied. "He doesn't want anything to do with them. He feels nothing." Joe clenched his fists, his anger evident. "He doesn't know what he's missing." Amelia looked at her daughters and sighed. "I didn't do it for him. I did it for the girls. I needed to be sure there was nothing left to expect from him." "And now?" Joe asked. "Now I move on. I don't want the girls growing up under the shadow of a father who never cared." Joe nodded, admiring the strength Amelia was showing. He knew she still carried the pain, but he could also see a renewed determination in her. The next morning, Joe surprised Amelia with a small gift, a notebook and an elegant pen. "What's this?" she asked, curious. "A tool for you to plan your future," he replied. "I want you to write down your goals and what you need to achieve them. We'll work on it together." Amelia smiled, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Joe. I don't know what I'd do without you. You do exactly what you're doing now, rebuilding. I'm just here to make sure you have every chance to succeed." With Joe's support, Amelia continued her studies, determined to create a better life for herself and her daughters. The confrontation with Ryan had been painful, but it was also freeing. Now she knew she no longer had to look back. Days passed in an increasingly organized routine. Amelia now focused entirely on her studies and raising the twins, while Joe remained by her side, offering unwavering support. The relationship between the two grew deeper and more natural, marked by shared understanding and small acts of care. One afternoon, as Amelia reviewed her notes in the living room, Joe walked in with a folder in hand and a mysterious smile. She looked at him, intrigued. "What's that?" she asked, resting the notebook on her lap. "An opportunity," Joe replied, handing her the folder. Inside were documents and a preliminary contract. Amelia read the header, Project Assistant, Blackwood Financial Group. She frowned and looked at Joe, confused. "Are you asking me to work for you?" "I'm not trying to pressure you, Amelia, but I thought this might be a good way for you to start your career while applying what you're learning. It's a temporary position with enough flexibility for you to keep studying and taking care of the girls." Amelia hesitated, reading through the details of the contract. The offer was generous, but she still felt unsure. Working directly with Joe could be complicated, given the emotional bond they were building. "Joe, I'm not sure I'm the right person for this. I don't have any experience." "You have more than you think," he said. "You're learning quickly and have already shown you can handle challenges. I'm not offering this as a favor, I genuinely believe in your potential." Joe's words felt sincere, and Amelia could sense the weight of his encouragement. She knew taking this job would be a big step, but she also feared she might not live up to expectations. After a few seconds of silence, she took a deep breath and smiled faintly. "All right, I'll do it." Joe smiled, clearly pleased. "You won't regret it. We'll take things slow, and over time, you'll see just how capable you are." The next morning, Amelia was introduced to Joe's team. Despite her nervousness, she quickly realized that he had chosen patient and understanding individuals to guide her. The job required organization, attention to detail, and the ability to manage deadlines, but Amelia faced each challenge with determination. The twins also seemed happier and more settled into their new routine. They spent afternoons playing in Evergreen Park, a beautiful green space near Joe's mansion, filling the once quiet house with the sound of childish laughter and energy. Joe often joined them when he could, strengthening his bond with the girls. One evening, while Amelia was reviewing documents in the office, Joe walked in with 2 cups of tea. He set one beside her and sat on the nearby couch. "You're doing really well," he remarked, watching her. Amelia smiled, her cheeks warming slightly. "I still have a lot to learn, but I'm enjoying the challenge. That's what matters. Growth comes through effort, and you're showing admirable strength." She looked away for a moment, trying to manage the wave of emotions his words stirred. "Thank you for believing in me, Joe. Truly." He simply smiled in response, and the silence that followed felt comfortable, almost intimate. Over the following weeks, the connection between Amelia and Joe deepened. Small gestures, like lingering glances or brief touches, hinted at feelings they were both hesitant to acknowledge, but there was no denying that something was changing. One afternoon, during a team meeting, Amelia presented an idea to streamline the logistics of a project, surprising everyone in the room. Joe, clearly proud, didn't hide his smile as he praised her initiative. "Excellent suggestion, Amelia. We'll implement this right away." She thanked him, feeling confident and fulfilled for the first time in years. At the end of the day, as they walked to the parking lot, Joe stopped and looked her in the eye. Amelia, do you realize how much you've grown since you got here? She shook her head, smiling softly. I still feel like I have so much to prove. You don't need to prove anything to anyone, he said. You're already amazing just as you are. Amelia's heart raced, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to fade. Joe stepped closer as though he wanted to say more, but the sound of the twins running toward them interrupted him. Mommy, look what we made! Clara and Gracie shouted, holding up colorful drawings. Amelia laughed and knelt down to hug them. Joe watched the scene with a smile, feeling a deep sense of happiness just being with them. Later that night, as she tucked the girls into bed, Amelia reflected on how much her life had changed over the past few months. Joe's support, the affection he showed the twins, and the way he encouraged her to move forward meant more to her than she could put into words. As she lay down, Amelia felt a mix of gratitude and apprehension. She knew she was falling for Joe, but a part of her still feared opening her heart again. Joe, on the other hand, found himself thinking about Amelia more and more. She was strong, resilient, and dedicated, qualities he deeply admired. Despite their complicated pasts, he felt there was something special between them, something worth exploring. In the weeks to come, these feelings would only grow harder to ignore. The nights in Joe's mansion grew increasingly quiet after long days of work and play with Clara and Gracie. Amelia often found herself lost in deep reflection, sitting on the edge of her bed with the lights dimmed. She thought about how much her life had changed, yet even surrounded by Joe's comfort and support, a shadow of the past still lingered over her. That night, Joe couldn't sleep either. He sat in the living room, staring at the flickering fire in the fireplace, his thoughts revolving around Amelia. Something about the way she withdrew at times troubled him. He knew they needed to have an honest conversation about what they were both feeling to move forward. The next morning, as Clara and Gracie played in the garden, Joe took the opportunity to approach Amelia. She was in the kitchen, organizing groceries that had just arrived. He entered quietly, observing her for a moment before speaking. Amelia, can we talk? She paused, sensing from his tone that this wasn't an ordinary conversation. Of course. What is it? Joe gestured for her to follow him to the living room. They sat down and he began. There's something I've wanted to say for a while, but I wasn't sure how. Amelia leaned forward slightly, her heart starting to race. What is it? I deeply admire your strength and resilience, he said. But I can see that you're still carrying a lot of guilt. I think it's time for you to let it go. She looked away, his words striking a sensitive chord. Joe, I know I've made many mistakes. I made choices that brought me here, and sometimes I feel like I don't deserve the life you're offering me. Joe shook his head. No one is perfect, Amelia. We all make mistakes, but you've been doing everything you can to overcome your challenges. You deserve this and so much more. His words felt like a soothing balm on wounds she had hidden for so long. Amelia took a deep breath, realizing it was time to confront her insecurities. Joe, I've never apologized for how I treated you when we were younger. I was selfish and immature, and I didn't see the value of the people around me. I hurt you, and I'm sorry for that. Joe was silent for a moment, taking in her words. Finally, he said, Amelia, the past doesn't matter anymore. We've both changed, and what matters now is what we're building together. I forgive you, and I hope you can forgive yourself. Tears welled in Amelia's eyes, but this time they weren't from sadness. It felt as if a tremendous weight was being lifted from her shoulders. She looked at Joe, who met her gaze with calm understanding. Thank you, Joe, for everything. You don't need to thank me, he replied. I'm here because I want to be. That moment marked the start of a new chapter for them. The tension from the past began to fade, and they both felt they could finally open up to each other fully. In the days that followed, Amelia noticed a lightness in her heart she hadn't felt in years. She threw herself into her work and studies with renewed enthusiasm, while Joe continued to support her every step of the way. One evening, after putting the twins to bed, Amelia found Joe in the garden sitting in one of the rocking chairs. The soft moonlight illuminated his face, and he seemed lost in thought. Are you okay? She asked, sitting beside him. Joe smiled. Yeah, I was just thinking about how much has changed. I remember when I saw you that night on the sidewalk, I never imagined we'd end up here. Neither did I, Amelia admitted, but I'm glad it happened. Me too. The silence between them was comfortable, as though words weren't necessary. Joe looked at Amelia, the gentle glow of the moon reflecting in her eyes. He knew he was falling for her, but he didn't want to rush anything. Amelia, do you believe in second chances? Joe asked, breaking the silence. She smiled, pondering his question. I think I'm starting to. Joe nodded, encouraged by her response. He knew they were heading towards something special, something both of them needed, but only time could solidify it. The next morning, Joe decided to plan a surprise for Amelia and the twins. He arranged a small trip to Willowbrook Farm, a charming rural getaway just outside Boston Hills. Clara and Gracie were ecstatic when they heard the idea, and Amelia, though surprised, was grateful for the chance to spend meaningful time with her daughters and Joe. The day was filled with laughter and unforgettable moments. The girls fed the farm animals, ran through the fields, and enjoyed homemade ice cream at the farm's cozy cafe. Amelia felt more connected to Joe than ever before. He seemed completely at ease interacting with the twins as if he had always been part of their family. At the end of the day, as they drove home, Clara and Gracie were fast asleep in the back seat, exhausted but happy. Amelia watched Joe as he drove silently, a slight smile on his face. Thank you for today, she said softly. There's no need to thank me. It was a special day for all of us. Yes, it was, she agreed, and it meant so much to me to see the girls so happy. This is just the beginning, Amelia, Joe said. There are many more moments like this ahead of us. She smiled, warmed by his words. For the first time in years, she believed the future could be bright. When they arrived at the house, Joe carried the twins to their room, making sure they were comfortable before turning off the lights. Amelia stood nearby, moved by the care and dedication he showed. That night, as she lay in bed, Amelia felt ready to finally let go of the past. Joe was right, second chances did exist, and she wouldn't waste the one she had been given. Mornings at Joe's mansion were now filled with life. Clara and Gracie ran through the house, laughing and filling the space with contagious joy. Joe, who had once lived a quiet life focused solely on work, found himself increasingly involved in the twins' routines and, more importantly, in Amelia's growth. One morning, Amelia was getting ready to leave. Joe had invited her to accompany him to an important meeting, an opportunity to observe how he handled negotiations and led his team. Though excited, she was also nervous. She didn't want to make any mistakes or feel out of place. Are you ready? Joe asked, waiting for her by the entrance. More or less, she replied. I hope I don't mess up. You'll do great, Amelia. Trust yourself. When they arrived at the Blackwood Financial Center, Amelia was impressed by its modern elegance. Joe guided her to the meeting room where several executives were already gathered. He introduced her as a promising collaborator, making her feel both proud and slightly self-conscious. During the meeting, Amelia listened attentively, absorbing every detail. Joe encouraged her to share some of her ideas, and to her surprise, her suggestions were well received. You have a very clear perspective, one of the executives commented. Thank you, Amelia replied with a modest smile. I'm still learning, but I'm glad I could contribute. Joe watched the interaction with satisfaction. He had always known Amelia was capable, but seeing others recognize her abilities was even more rewarding. After the meeting, Joe took her to a charming cafe called the Green Ivy Cafe nearby. They sat at an outdoor table, and Amelia, now relaxed, ordered a cappuccino. You were amazing today, Joe said, taking a sip of his coffee. I was so nervous, she admitted, but it was exciting to be part of it. This is just the beginning, he replied. You're building something solid, Amelia. She looked at him, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. None of this would be possible without you, Joe. You believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. All I did was show you the way, he said. The credit is all yours. Their moment was interrupted by a call from Mrs. Cooper, letting Amelia know that Clara and Gracie were asking for her. Joe smiled. Looks like your little ones miss you. They're attached, Amelia said with a laugh. They can't stay away for long. When they returned home, Clara and Gracie ran to their mother, hugging her tightly. Joe watched the scene, feeling an ever-deepening connection with the girls. He loved their boundless energy and how their laughter could brighten any space. Later that afternoon, Joe decided to organize a small picnic in Willow Creek Park, a peaceful green area near his mansion. Clara and Gracie were thrilled, helping to pack a basket with sandwiches, fruit, and juice. Amelia sat on a blanket spread out on the lawn, watching the girls run around with Joe. You're getting more and more comfortable with them, she said as Joe sat down beside her. They're incredible kids, he replied. It's impossible not to grow attached. Thank you for being so good to them, Joe, she said. They feel safe and happy here, and that's all I've ever wanted. Joe smiled gently. They're part of you, Amelia, and for me, that's enough. His words touched her deeply, and she felt her heart race. She knew her feelings for Joe went beyond gratitude. but the fear of fully opening her heart still held her back. As night fell, Clara and Gracie finally grew tired and fell asleep in their mother's arms. Joe helped Amelia carry them to their room, and together they carefully tucked the girls in. As they stepped out into the hallway, Amelia paused, looking at Joe. "You've changed our lives, you know that." "You've changed mine too," he replied. The intensity in Joe's gaze made her feel vulnerable yet safe at the same time. She knew she could no longer ignore what she was feeling. Later that evening, while Amelia was in the kitchen preparing a cup of tea, Joe walked in. He stood silently for a moment, watching her before stepping closer. "Amelia, there's something I need to say." She turned to face him, her heart beating faster. "What is it?" Joe hesitated briefly but decided to be honest. "Since you came here, my life has completely changed. You and the girls have brought something into my world that I didn't even realize was missing. I care about you, Amelia, far more than I can put into words." His words washed over her like a wave, catching her off guard. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond, but then she smiled, her eyes glistening. "Joe, I care about you too, but all of this, it's still so new to me. I need time." Joe nodded, respecting her honesty. "I understand. I'm not asking you to rush. I just wanted you to know how I feel." Their moment was interrupted by a faint noise from upstairs. Clara had woken up and was calling for her mother. Amelia smiled and went to tend to her, leaving Joe alone in the kitchen. He sighed, looking at the abandoned teacup on the counter. Winning Amelia's complete trust would take time, but he was willing to wait. What he felt for her and the girls was worth every moment of patience. In the days that followed, the relationship between Joe and Amelia continued to grow, marked by small yet meaningful moments. With each passing day, Amelia felt herself opening up to him more, while Joe remained patient, giving her the space she needed to heal and trust. There was still a long journey ahead, but both were ready to face whatever came their way together. One evening, Joe decided to surprise Amelia with a special dinner. He asked Mrs. Cooper to look after the twins and personally prepared a meal for the two of them. When Amelia came downstairs and saw the elegantly set table, she was speechless. "You did all this?" she asked in disbelief. "I wanted to do something special for you," he replied with a smile. During dinner, they talked about everything: work, childhood memories, dreams for the future. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and they felt increasingly comfortable in each other's presence. "I never imagined I'd be here with this chance to start over," Amelia said, reflecting. "And if it weren't for you, Joe, I don't know where we'd be now." "You'd be somewhere, fighting like you always have," he said. "I just had the privilege of helping. But it was more than that. You believed in me when no one else did. That makes all the difference." Joe reached across the table and took her hand. "I'll always believe in you, Amelia. Always." His touch was warm and reassuring, and Amelia felt the walls she had built over the years begin to crumble. She knew she still had her fears, but she also knew Joe was unlike anyone she had ever met. When dinner ended, Joe walked her to her bedroom door. For a moment, they stood in silence, just looking at each other. "Good night, Joe," Amelia said softly with a gentle smile. "Good night, Amelia." As she closed the door, she leaned against it, feeling her heart race. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she wasn't alone. Joe, meanwhile, walked down the stairs with a smile on his face. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to take every step needed to win Amelia's heart completely. That night, as gentle rain began to fall over Boston Hills, both Amelia and Joe fell asleep with a newfound sense of hope, as if the future was starting to reveal itself clearly. Amelia and Joe's daily lives began to flow with a surprising ease that caught them both off guard. The twins were growing increasingly attached to Joe, and he, in turn, showed genuine affection for them. Yet Amelia still had moments of doubt, not about her feelings, but about whether she was ready to fully trust someone again. One afternoon, while Amelia was working on reports in Joe's office, her phone buzzed on the desk. It was a message from an unknown number. When she opened it, she saw a photo of Joe talking to an elegant woman at a restaurant called the Copper Lantern. The caption read, "Do you really know who he is?" Amelia's heart raced. While she knew Joe had a social life and professional contacts, the message unsettled her. The doubt she had tried to push away came rushing back. Who is that woman, and why would someone send her a message like that? Joe arrived home later that day, seemingly at ease. He found Amelia in the living room with the twins playing nearby. He immediately noticed something was wrong. "Are you okay?" he asked, sitting beside her. Amelia hesitated for a moment before showing him the message. "I got this today." Joe frowned as he looked at the image. "That was a business meeting. She's a consultant we hired for a new project." Amelia wanted to believe him, but the message had cast a shadow over her trust. Why would someone send this to me, Joe? It feels like they're trying to warn me about something. I don't know, he replied, but I can find out. Amelia, you have to trust me. I would never do anything to hurt you. His voice was steady, and his tone carried genuine sincerity. Amelia looked into his eyes and saw something she couldn't ignore, the transparency of someone with nothing to hide. I want to trust you, Joe, but this caught me off guard. My whole life has been filled with disappointments, and it's hard to ignore that fear. Joe gently held her hands, giving them a reassuring squeeze. I understand, Amelia. I won't pressure you. I just want you to know that I'm here to face anything by your side. In the days that followed, Joe investigated the source of the message and discovered it had been sent by a disgruntled former employee he had let go months ago. He showed Amelia the evidence, making it clear there was nothing to fear. Amelia felt a mix of relief and guilt. She knew she was still learning to trust, but she also realized that Joe was willing to do whatever it took to ensure her emotional security. One night, after putting the twins to bed, Amelia went to Joe's office. He was focused on some documents but looked up as she entered. Can we talk? She asked, closing the door behind her. Of course. What's on your mind? Amelia sat in the chair across from his desk and took a deep breath. I want to apologize for doubting you. I know the message shook me, but that doesn't excuse my lack of trust. You've always been honest with me, and I need to be fair to you. Joe gave her a soft smile. You don't need to apologize, Amelia. I know how hard it is for you to let your guard down. I'm here to help, not to judge. His words struck a chord, and Amelia felt tears well up in her eyes. You're so different from anything I've ever known, Joe. It scares me, but it also makes me want to believe I can be happy again. Joe stood and walked over to her, kneeling by her side. He gently wiped away a tear that had fallen down her cheek. You can be happy, Amelia, and you don't have to do it alone. That night, something shifted between them. The walls Amelia had kept up for so long finally began to crumble. The days that followed were filled with increasingly meaningful moments of closeness. Joe continued to show patience and care, while Amelia slowly allowed herself to trust him completely. One afternoon, as they strolled through Willow Creek Park with Clara and Gracie, Joe watched Amelia playing with the girls. In that moment, he felt an unshakable certainty this was the life he wanted. He wanted to be with her and the twins forever. When they returned home, Joe asked Mrs. Cooper to watch the girls for a few hours. He took Amelia to the mansion's terrace, the same spot where they had shared a pivotal conversation months earlier. Amelia, there's something I want to say, he began. She looked at him, her heart racing. What is it? Joe reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box, opening it to reveal a delicate ring. I want to spend the rest of my life with you and the girls. You've brought joy and purpose into my life in a way I never thought possible. Amelia, will you marry me? Tears filled Amelia's eyes as she covered her mouth in shock. Joe, yes, I will. Joe smiled as he slipped the ring onto her finger before pulling her into a tight embrace. The storm that had defined the start of their journey had finally passed, and they were ready to begin a new chapter together. As the twins slept peacefully in the next room, Amelia and Joe talked about their future plans, a simple wedding full of love and a life built on the trust and respect they had worked so hard to achieve. Preparations for Amelia and Joe's wedding began simply but with deep meaning for both of them. Amelia envisioned an intimate ceremony at Rosewood Estate, a cozy venue in the quiet suburbs of Boston Hills, surrounded only by people who had become part of their new life. Clara and Gracie were thrilled at the idea of being flower girls, and Joe involved them in every detail, from choosing bouquets to picking out dresses. Despite the joy that filled every moment, Amelia knew she still had to confront one last ghost from her past. While she had accepted that Ryan Mercer, the twins' biological father, would never take responsibility, she felt she needed to face him one final time. Joe, I need to talk to Ryan again, Amelia said one evening while they were on the terrace. Joe frowned, concerned. Do you think that's really necessary? Yes, she replied. Not for him, but for me. I need to close this chapter once and for all. Joe took her hand, his eyes full of understanding. If that's what you need, I'll be by your side. The next day, Joe managed to find Ryan's address. Amelia decided to meet him alone, but felt reassured knowing Joe was just a phone call away. When she arrived, she found Ryan standing outside a small, dimly lit bar called the Red Fox Tavern, looking worn down by the choices he'd made. Amelia, he said, surprised to see her. Yes, it's me. We need to talk. Ryan sighed and gestured for her to follow him to a table in the corner. He looked uneasy, as though hoping this wouldn't take long. Why are you here? He asked, his voice tired. I'm here to tell you I don't expect anything from you anymore, Amelia replied. You made your choice years ago, but the girls deserve to know that I did everything I could to give them the best. And now I'm moving on. Ryan sat in silence, staring at the empty glass in front of him. I know I failed, Amelia, but I don't know how to be a father. I never did. That doesn't matter anymore, she said firmly. They have someone who loves them as if they were his own. Joe is everything you never were and never will be. Ryan didn't reply, but the look in his eyes showed he understood the weight of her words. Amelia stood up, feeling she had finally said everything she needed to. As she left the bar, she felt a sense of liberation she hadn't experienced in years. When she got home, she found Joe in the backyard with the twins, helping them set up a play tent. How did it go? He asked gently as she approached. It went exactly how it needed to, she replied. Now I'm truly ready to move on. Joe smiled warmly and pulled her into a hug. I'm proud of you. In the days that followed, Amelia focused entirely on wedding preparations and her new life with Joe and the girls. She finally felt she had found a home, not just physically, but in the love she shared with Joe and the laughter of Clara and Gracie. On the morning of the wedding, Amelia was nervous but radiant. Wearing an elegant white dress, she looked at herself in the mirror, thinking about how much her life had changed. Clara and Gracie, dressed like little princesses, burst into the room holding flower bouquets. You look beautiful, Mommy, Clara exclaimed joyfully. Thank you, my darlings. You both look stunning too. With her heart full of emotion, Amelia walked down the aisle where Joe was waiting. Their eyes met, and in that moment, all her doubts vanished. The wedding was simple but filled with love and meaning. Every word in their vows reaffirmed the bond they had built, not just as a couple but as a united family. When the ceremony ended, Clara and Gracie ran into Amelia and Joe's arms, squealing with joy. The future that once seemed uncertain was now a promise of happiness and togetherness. After the wedding, Joe's mansion felt even more alive. Clara and Gracie quickly adapted to the idea of having a complete family, and Amelia felt she had finally found her place in the world. Their days were filled with laughter and tender moments as she and Joe built their new routine together. On her first morning as a married woman, Amelia woke to the sound of birds outside the garden. She turned to find Joe beside her, watching her with a peaceful smile. Good morning, Mrs. Blackwood, he said softly. She smiled, still adjusting to her new last name. Good morning. Ready to start our new life? More than ready, he replied. The first months of their marriage were filled with gratitude and renewal. Joe supported Amelia in balancing her work and studies while continuing to be a dedicated father figure to Clara and Gracie. He made it a point to be present for every important moment in the girls' lives, from small school achievements to bedtime stories. Amelia felt blessed to have a partner who shared her commitment to their family. One afternoon, while organizing some paperwork in the home office, Amelia began feeling lightheaded. Assuming it was just fatigue, she decided to rest. However, the symptoms persisted over the following days. Joe noticed her exhaustion and insisted she visit Greenwood Medical Center. It's just exhaustion, Joe. I'm fine, she said, trying to reassure him. It might be, he replied, but it won't hurt to check. I want to make sure you're taking care of yourself. Reluctantly, Amelia agreed and scheduled an appointment. She felt a bit anxious but didn't expect any major news. However, after routine exams, the doctor delivered news that would once again change their lives. Congratulations, Mrs. Blackwood. You're pregnant. Amelia sat in silence for a moment, processing what she had just heard. Pregnant. The thought of having a child with Joe filled her with both joy and surprise. When she returned home, she found Joe in the living room playing with Clara and Gracie. His smile reassured her that this was the perfect moment to share the news. Joe, can we talk for a moment? She asked. He noticed the seriousness in her tone and asked the girls to go play in their room. Once they were alone, Joe stepped closer, curious. What is it, Amelia? She took a deep breath, trying to hold back her emotions. Joe, I went to the doctor today, and I found out I'm pregnant. For a moment, Joe was silent, processing her words. Then a huge smile lit up his face. You're pregnant. She nodded, tears in her eyes. Yes, we're going to have a baby. Joe pulled her into a tight embrace, his heart overflowing with joy. This is amazing, Amelia. I don't even know what to say. The following weeks were filled with excitement as they began preparing for the new addition to their family. Clara and Gracie were thrilled at the news that they would have a sibling and eagerly helped Amelia pick out clothes and decorate the nursery. Finally, on a peaceful evening, Amelia went into labor. Joe quickly took her to Greenwood Medical Center, where hours later, the sound of a baby's cry filled the delivery room, bringing indescribable joy to their hearts. It was a healthy baby boy. Joe held the newborn tenderly while Amelia looked at them both with tears of happiness. "Welcome to the family, little one," Joe whispered, overcome with emotion. Clara and Gracie, who had been waiting eagerly in the hallway, were brought in to meet their brother. They promised to always care for and protect him. Life at Joe's mansion felt complete. What once seemed like an unlikely family was now a shining example of love, unity, and resilience. Each challenge had made them stronger, and the future seemed brighter than ever. For Amelia, Joe, Clara, Gracie, and their new son, this was not just an ending but a beautiful beginning. Together, they faced the days ahead with the certainty that no matter what came their way, they would always have each other.